A transfer of power in Washington was being watched very closely from 10,000 kilometers away in Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu made some bold moves in the dying days of the Trump administration, expanding settlements in the occupied West Bank. How will the new U.S. administration respond? I'm Maria Ramos, and today on The Newsmakers, we look at the future of U.S.-Israel ties. Not long after Joe Biden was sworn in, Israel's Prime Minister sent a message urging the new U.S. president to continue to work towards peace and to join forces to confront their common enemy, Iran. Benjamin Netanyahu then thanked Donald Trump for, quote, all the great things he did for Israel. Now, one of those things, presumably, was throwing aside decades of U.S. diplomacy by declaring that building new settlements did not breach international law. Netanyahu is continuing, in his words, to build the land of Israel by ordering a wave of new settlement homes in the occupied West Bank this past week. In addition to being an early foreign policy test for the new U.S. administration, the latest settlement expansion could further undermine the prospect of a viable two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And as Natalie Pahonen reports, Biden may view that less favorably than his predecessor.
Another construction zone in the occupied West Bank. These Jewish settlements are considered illegal by most of the international community. It hasn't stopped the Israeli government from announcing about 800 new homes are going to be built. The UN has called on Israel to halt and reverse the decision. Palestinian groups have condemned the move.
It's an attempt to race against time and benefit after the American elections from the last days of the current US administration before the new administration to try to put facts on the ground.
For some settler groups, this is viewed as purely an Israeli matter.
Israel's citizens expect to be allowed to live and build and develop in a natural manner, and the responsibility to do so belongs to the government of Israel. It's not an issue for other countries.
But both here and abroad, there's mounting anticipation about what the US reaction will be, particularly around the timing of this announcement. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the US's 45th President Donald Trump have displayed an exceptionally close relationship over the past 4 years, not just for their own domestic audiences, but for the global one as well. The Trump White House broke with what had been considered long-standing US foreign policy by being pro-settlement. But a new US administration means a reset in the relationship between Israel and Washington, D.C. To envision what the future of the relationship between these two allies might look like, it's important to consider the past. Joe Biden has been viewed as a long-standing supporter of Israel throughout his political career. He's seen as a backer of the two-state solution. He's also a critic of the settlements. In 2010, on a visit to Israel and the Palestinian territories, the then Vice President Biden rebuked the Israeli authorities over their announcement they would build 1,600 new homes in the occupied West Bank.
The decision by the Israeli government to advance planning for new housing units in East Jerusalem undermines that very trust, the trust that we need right now in order to begin as well as produce profitable negotiations. That is why I immediately condemned the action.
That was, of course, more than a decade ago, but it does set a tone for what's to come. Biden has pledged to restore aid to Palestinians that was cut by the Trump administration, and the new president wants to renew the peace process. Keep in mind, Israel is also heading to the polls in March. It will be the fourth election in less than 2 years. And once again, Netanyahu's political career is on the line. So while there could be a new PM in the months ahead, the diplomatic ties forged over decades between Israel and the US will no doubt remain deep. Natalie Pahonen, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from New York is Osamah Khalil. He's an associate history professor at Syracuse University, specializing in U.S. foreign relations and the Middle East. And in West Jerusalem, we have Eli Hazan. He's the Foreign Affairs Director of Israel's Likud party. And Daniel Seideman is the director of Terrestrial Jerusalem, an NGO that tracks developments which could impact the peace process. Gentlemen, welcome to the Newsmakers. I want to go first to you, Eli Hazan. Trump's support to Israel has been described as exceptional, unprecedented, but he has gone now. Is Israel worried? Are you worried?
No, we are not worried. In the end, we have to deal with challenges, and this is another challenge that we have to deal with. Don't forget, we were able to move after the Obama's years, and I don't want to say that Obama was not a friend to Israel. We had a lot of disagreements. I guess we will have disagreements with Biden as well. But in a contrary to 2016, Israel is more stronger. We have more allies in the region. There is a lot of troubles in the United States. So the situation is a bit different. And I truly believe that Biden will understand that he needs Israel and Netanyahu next to him as not against him.
So if you're not worried, why did Netanyahu, well, it really looked like he was pushing through, rushing to push through many things, expanding illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank in those final days of Trump's administration?
First of all, it's not illegal. You can call it illegal. For us, it's very legit. I must say that and emphasize it. We've been doing that for so many years. Ever since 1967, there is more than 200,000 Israelis live in what you call illegal. For us, it's very legit. It's not necessarily because of Biden, but you have only look after what we have did in the last years. Don't forget, besides that, according to the deal of the century, and I'm not saying that Biden is going to adopt it, we are not going to uproot anyone from his place, not Jews, neither Arabs. And we are going on with our policy for so many years, and that is the policy of Netanyahu during Obama and during Trump, and it would be our policy during Biden.
Daniel Seideman.
5 hours before the inauguration yesterday, Netanyahu approved, the final approval, gave the green light for tenders in the most devastating settlement in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank of Matos. It has been so controversial that for a decade, Netanyahu did not dare implement, even under Trump. The fact that he chose to do it 5 hours before the inauguration was not a coincidence. It was not an accident. It was done with malice aforethought. And it fit into a pattern in the days before the inauguration, which you've described, where we saw a surge in settlement activity. This is clearly an attempt to challenge President Biden before he assumed office. The president is going to have to deal with a pandemic. He's going to have to deal with an economy that's tanking, with Iran, Russia, and China. And here, someone who purports to be the closest ally of the United States presents him with the gift of a gratuitous crisis.
Why do you call it the most devastating settlement, Daniel?
Givat Matos is one of two settlements, perhaps three, that in and of themselves could prevent the creation of a reasonable border between Israel and a Palestinian state. Now, President Biden is inheriting scorched earth. 4 years of a concerted effort, both by President Trump and Netanyahu, to denationalize the Palestinians and fragment Palestine. If we are to resume any kind of credible political process, the possibility of a border between Israel and Palestine is absolutely essential. Before Givat Matos, the creation of that border remains possible. After Givat Matos, it will be impossible. Everybody knows that. Netanyahu knows that everybody thinks that way. And he decided to poke a finger in President Biden's eye. Why? It baffles me. He's going to need President Biden on Iran, but he is showing that that President Trump may be gone, but he remains the Republican prime minister from Israel.
Eli, just to quote Daniel there, poking Biden's eye by choosing this most devastating settlement. Again, quoting Daniel. Why?
I think Daniel is mistaken. It's not poke, the hand. Not at all. Givat Matos is part of Jerusalem. We've been doing that since 1967 to bring back Jews to settle in East Jerusalem in what Jordan used to occupy until 1967. You can call it whatever you want. I really respect it, but I fully disagree. We are not going to give up over Jerusalem. Jerusalem is going to stay under Israeli sovereignty. Even in a permanent agreement, this is one of the terms that Netanyahu already said. It's part of the deal of the century, so we cannot find any trouble with it. And I hope that Biden will accept it.
I want to go to you, Osamah. So much has happened in these past 4 years. How would you describe what happened and what Trump and Netanyahu have done? To many, this could look like legacy. To others, destruction.
Right. So I think it's important to put it into a broader context. I think what we've seen just in the past few days by Netanyahu actually fits into a broader pattern since 1967, right? And that is a pattern of a slow creeping annexation by Israel over the Palestinian territories, particularly the West Bank, including redefining Jerusalem, redefining the actual greater metropolitan Jerusalem area. And unfortunately, what's happened is the United States, there's often a lot of hand-wringing from the United States and some public condemnation, but very little in the way of actual pressure that prevents Israel from continuing this constant and steady annexation. Now, one of your guests had mentioned that this is the way they've always been doing things and that this is not illegal. Everybody knows it's illegal. The Israelis know what they're doing is illegal under international law, and yet they continue to do it because they're able to get away with it. I think one of the other things to keep in mind is what Netanyahu did fits into a broader pattern of what Israeli prime ministers have always done. As administrations shift in the United States, they try and get as much as they can out of the administration going out and put pressure on the administration coming in. And we've seen that again. At the same time, we've heard a number of references to the deal of the century and a number of references to a potential Palestinian state. And what has become clear over the past 2 decades is that a Palestinian state has become impossible, and Israel has no interest in being a partner to peace. It often claims that it doesn't have a partner to peace on the Palestinian side, but it's had one for over 2 decades. It refuses, absolutely refuses, and this government under Netanyahu has made it clear, absolutely refuses to allow a Palestinian state to emerge.
And on that, you say a Palestinian state now looks impossible. Biden is a supporter of a 2-state solution. What can he do? What can he change?
Well, I think if he really was, much like previous presidents, if previous presidents really had the political will, right, to actually allow for a Palestinian state to emerge, there are a number of aspects that could be done to do this. Everyone pretty much knows what the parameters of a 2-state solution are. Unfortunately, what's happened is, and as your guest, one of your guests mentioned, that Israel is not planning to displace Palestinians, right? It's not going to displace Arabs. It's doing it on a daily basis. Every time a settlement is built, it's built on Palestinian land. It's built on private Palestinian land. The Israelis are currently seizing and displacing Palestinians in the Jordan River Valley. They are currently seizing and displacing Palestinian Bedouins. And they know this. They know what they're doing. They're doing it in open violation of international law. They're doing it in the eyes of the world. And in fact, what we've seen in the past 6 months is 2 Israeli human rights organizations, and we expect more, have now started to call what everyone has known for some time that Israel is an apartheid state.
Would you go as far, Osamah, sorry to jump in, as calling them war crimes? Because Human Rights Watch has said Netanyahu took advantage of Trump's final days to put expansion of his, quote, war crime settlements into overdrive. Would you go as far as calling it war crimes?
What we know, and here I think the Israeli human rights organizations and Human Rights Watch are the actual experts on this. We know what Israel is doing is in violation of a slew of international laws. We know that this border, that in fact, they've now been labeled an apartheid state, which we've known for some time, right? We know that in the borders of historic Palestine, so Israel and the occupied territories, that the majority are Palestinian Arabs. That is the majority of the population, and that they are subjected to a range of different laws that are separate and unequal to those accorded to Israeli Jews. So we know that Israel is guilty of the crime of apartheid and under international law. We know that. We also know that Israel is guilty of war crimes, as it has displayed in Gaza repeatedly over the past 2 decades. We know that Israel is in violation of international law, both through the creation of settlements, through its apartheid wall, through its the matrix of occupation and control, including, let's not forget, Israel now holds some 200 or more children under the age of 16 in Israeli prisons who are subjected to all kinds of dehumanizing treatment. This has been well documented, right? Okay. And in fact, I think one of the things when we talk about Israeli war crimes, we know that this is documented. It's documented in light of the world. So when we talk about what can Joe Biden do, what Joe Biden can actually do is start to apply for once U.S. law as it applies to the settlements, U.S. law as it applies to aid to Israel and the use of its weapons against the civilian population, and it can actually start to develop some political will. Okay. Will Joe Biden do that? I doubt it.
Let's see.
There is
Eli,
many lies
respond.
in what he's saying. Many lies in what he is saying. Many lies. For instance, take Gaza, for instance. Israel pulled out of Gaza completely in 2005. What we've got ever since is shooting missiles again and again and again and again. This is war crimes. Israel doesn't making any kind of an apartheid. You have the Palestinian Authority who's using a lot of terror against Israelis. Don't forget, you don't have a Palestinian state because of the Palestinians. How Abba Evan, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, used to say, the Palestinians did not miss a chance for a Palestinian state. That is the issue. That is the issue, and you should remember that. We may not be perfect, but on the other hand, why do you ignore of the crimes of the Palestinian Authority, of the crimes of Hamas? Why don't you criticize every time there is an obstacle from the Palestinian side in order to create a Palestinian state? You don't do it, and you know exactly why. It contradicts your ideology.
Daniel, you've been listening.
I'm not sure what ideology you're referring to.
Yes.
I'm not sure what ideology you're referring to, but let me, if I can just reply to that real quick.
1 second.
The Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas has over and over again, and I've been a critic of Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority for a long time, but they've been Israel's best friend at this point, all right? The Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas have over and over again, concession after concession, in public and in secret negotiations with Israel, practically given Israel every single concession it wants. The outlines of a two-state solution are well known. It's also very clear that Benjamin Netanyahu has in fact bragged about it, that he is the one who destroyed the Oslo Accords, that he has no interest in creating a Palestinian state, and that there will not be a Palestinian state. Secondly, Israel is the occupying power of the West Bank and Gaza. The entire international community knows it, and you know it. Israel has embarked on a siege of Gaza since 2005. It has had multiple invasions of Gaza, and it has you keep referring to Hamas. Israel is the one that negotiates with Hamas, both publicly and privately. So you both know, and your government knows what the solution is here. You refuse to do it. And that's because Israel's policy, quite frankly, has been very simple. Israel wants all the land with none of the people on it. It wants as much land as it can grab with as few Palestinians on it.
Lies. You're lying. That's the truth. Sorry.
Daniel, you've heard both sides there.
Right.
Where is the truth?
The former head of our Mossad, Tamir Pardo, said a while back that Israel confronts one existential threat to our existence in this generation, and it's not the Iranian nuclear capability or 120,000 Hezbollah rockets, it's perpetual occupation. Why don't we blame the Palestinians? Well, I'm not an apologist for the Palestinian Authority, but the simple fact is we, Israel, I, occupy the West Bank, I occupy East Jerusalem, we occupy Gaza. Now, I've been monitoring settlements for the last 30 years, and Israel has planted 200,000 residents in large settlement neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. We did that without displacing Palestinians. That's now over. In two targeted areas, in Silwan, Batan al-Hawa, and Sheikh Jarrah, the state of Israel, in my name, is engaged in the forceful displacement of an entire community in both of these places. I'm an Israeli, I'm a patriot, I'm a Zionist, but I cannot avoid saying that the forceful displacement of a civilian population under occupation is a war crime. And it's a war crime that we are beginning to implement. I don't take any pride in saying that. I want to stop it. But the
Daniel,
only way this ends is by ending occupation.
I want to jump in, Daniel.
Yes.
Would things be different if Netanyahu were no longer around, if he loses the March elections, for example? Or is there enough support for these broader actions within Israel?
I believe that the greatest malady that the Israeli public is now suffering from is clinical occupation denial. We're in a state of deep denial. Occupation, what occupation? We're sipping cappuccino on the edge of a volcano. We need to confront who we are. We need to look in the mirror, and we need a president in the White House who is going to force us to look in the mirror and to hold us accountable. Giving us a pass on settlements and occupation is like being a wealthy uncle who sends his nephew off for drug rehabilitation, who will fund his nephew's meth addiction instead of sending him off to rehabilitation. We need to confront what is becoming of us. And what is becoming of us is less and less justifiable because occupation is metastasizing. I would hope that Netanyahu's successor would engage in these issues differently. I would hope that the international community, first and foremost, President Biden, will hold us accountable. It's not only good for the Palestinians, it's good for us. It's vital to the future of the Zionist enterprise.
Eli, how do you respond to that from Daniel?
Well, Daniel is in a minority. I would like to ask yourself, how come most of the Israelis is being very supportive of the right wing in Israel? How come, in 1992, Yitzhak Rabin, he won the election as the Labour Party and the left wing had a majority. How come the right wing has a big majority right now? There is a reason for that. And more than that, even the alternative for Netanyahu right now is one who used to be a minister in his cabinet from the right wing. There is a reason for that. And I truly believe that the reason is the refusal of the Palestinians to create a two-state solution and to find any other solution. Now, let's assume that Netanyahu doesn't want it. But have you asked yourself, how come that every time that we are looking for a solution, the Palestinians say no? And the Israeli public look at it and he knows exactly what's going on.
Osamah, I'll give you the last word. We have two words. Would a different Israeli government be different on settlements?
Well, I think, unfortunately, your guest from the Likud party is correct. I think that the Netanyahu is not going to be replaced by Mahatma Gandhi. Israel does not want peace. Israel wants occupation. Israel wants all of the Palestinian land with none of the Palestinians on it. This has been their policy since 1947, 1948. They have been displacing Palestinians, erasing Palestinians. They know it. Your guest knows it. Your guest has been a party to it. Your guest has been one of the apologists for this policy over and over again. This is a policy that has been both by the Labor and the Likud parties, the settlement policy. Mahmoud Abbas was willing and I am a deep critic of Mahmoud Abbas. Mahmoud Abbas was willing, and in fact, as we know, as was leaked, was even willing to agree to recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. And that was still not enough for Netanyahu. So at the end of the day, I don't see this Israeli government changing. I don't see it adopting a different policy. What needs to happen now is for the international community to have the political will to label Israel an apartheid state and to deal with it accordingly, as it did in the 1970s and 1980s with the minority regimes in southern Africa. And this is perhaps the only thing, a system of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and labeling Israel an apartheid state and dealing with it as the rogue pariah state it is.
We'll have to leave it there. Osamah, thank you very much indeed. Osamah Khalil and Eli Hazan and Daniel Seidemann, thank you, gentlemen, all of you, for joining us here on The Newsmakers. And thank you, our audience, for watching. See you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.